Hi, I'm Richard Bulzacchelli with Catholic Studies Academy. Today I'd like to talk about two passages in the Bible that have an interesting relationship with one another. These are the stories of the Tower of Babel, which we find in the book of Genesis, and toward the other end of the Bible, the account of the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. These two passages relate to one another as sort of inversions. So this sort of contrast, this kind of mirror image, is a technique that we find in biblical literature, through which some deep truth can be revealed to us. If we only heard the account of the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, we might not fully understand its significance. But if we can see this event in light of the Tower of Babel story, then suddenly the real significance of the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost becomes rather clear, as does the problem being addressed in the story of the Tower of Babel. In the divine pedagogy, these inversions help us to really understand the human condition, the nature of sin, and the divine action. So in the story of the Tower of Babel, we have an account of the world at a time when everyone sort of speaks the same language and about the same things. So here's the way this passage is often translated. Throughout the earth, men spoke the same language with the same vocabulary. That's kind of a more or less accurate translation. They spoke the same words about the same things, right? What does this really mean? It means that they were of one mind, of one culture, of one religion, right? That they saw the world in the same way. From a literary point of view, we might consider the story of the Tower of Babel, if we could sort of imagine it as a freestanding tale, as many scholars think that at one time it was. The Tower of Babel story is a kind of story about the fall of man. It depicts a state of the world, right, in which there's harmony between human beings. We all held the same view. We all worshiped in the same way. We all believed the same thing about God. But then something catastrophic occurred, and all of a sudden, division ensued. Now, as they moved eastward, that's significant, of course, because the east is the place where the sun rises. It's where God draws near to man. Because the sun, which gives light and warmth, and upon which the earth depends to bring forth life in the form of plants, right? Which sustain us and allow us to allow animals to live, right? This is a symbol of the divine presence. This is very important for us to understand in biblical imagery, right? As typology in the Bible, whenever we talk about an eastward direction, eastward movement, an eastward orientation, we're really talking about moving toward God or facing God. There's a lot of paradox in this, of course, because sometimes we're moving eastward even as we flee God, right? As in the story of the egress from Eden after the fall. But here, they're moving eastward, that is to say, toward God. And they found a plain in the land of Shinar where they settled. They said to one another, right, now this is the key, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them in the fire." For stone they used bricks, and for mortar they used bitumen. That's actually rather significant, isn't it? Because they're using bricks in the place of stone, something made by human beings in place of something foraged by human beings, but given by God. To do what? To build a temple, essentially. Come, they said, let us build ourselves a town and a tower with its top reaching heaven. This kind of tower, right, is typical of certain ritual structures that we find in ancient Babylonia. Let us make a name for ourselves. See? Let us make a name for ourselves. Right? It becomes about us, about human achievement, about what human beings can do, so that we may not be scattered about the whole earth. They try to control their lives and their destiny. Now, Yahweh came down to see the town and the tower that the sons of man had built. So they are all a single people with a single language, said Yahweh. Right? In other words, in this they are of one mind now, that they would think about themselves, that they would aggrandize themselves. It's on this now that they agree. This is their whole orientation. Not me, right? They had been oriented to the east, moving toward God. But now they turn inward upon themselves. They settle and build a town with something at the center to reach to heaven by their own power. They build the bricks. They make the bricks, right, with their own hands. And out of this they build the tower. This is the start of their undertakings. There will be nothing too hard for them to do now, right? There is nothing they will not do if they'll do this. Come, let us go down and confuse their language on the spot, so that they can no longer understand one another. Yahweh scattered them thence over the whole face of the earth, and they stopped building the town. It was named Babel, therefore, because there Yahweh confused the language of the whole earth. It was from there that Yahweh scattered them over the whole face of the earth. So here, again, you can see why it is, I might say, that the story of the Tower of Babel is an account of the fall of man. Here we see this attempt for human beings, right, with oneness of mind, to turn away from God and inward toward themselves, aggrandizing themselves, right? It becomes an anthropocentric view of reality, what we can achieve, rather than a theocentric view of reality, what God does, what God gives. The orientation is toward man, not God. But precisely because they wish to take their own destiny in their own hands, God responds by causing the very thing to happen to them that they fear would happen to them in a world in which they depended upon God. Thus, it's God who guarantees the harmony that they seek. And when they turn to themselves for it, what do they reap but disharmony, discord? No longer do they think with one mind, because in this move, in which they had first agreed with one another, they turned each to himself. There is no longer any common man if there's no God who defines us, right? If human being is, as we see in ancient Greek philosophy, the animal that has logos, and the logos, the ultimate reason behind the world, is none other than God himself, right? The ultimate account of all reality is really God, then by closing God off, we close ourselves to our own nature. No longer is there this commonality between us. Instead, it's just me and you, individuals, each one to himself, each one with his own mind, whose words, therefore, mean something unique to himself. There's no longer any common language, common discourse. And so there's radical alienation. Humanity is dispersed throughout the world. The result of this is a world in which peoples arise and live in an adversarial relationship with one another. Nations fight against nations, always seeking peace but never finding it for long, because we're always concerned first about ourselves and not oriented toward a genuine, common, and universal good, that is, friendship with God. By contrast, we see the story of the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. What a remarkable tale this is. If we pay attention, we can see that leading up to the story of Pentecost, the apostles find themselves practicing obedience, practicing receptivity to God, submission to God's will. This isn't the story of the Tower of Babel, in which they sought to reach for what was in heaven, to build a tower tall enough that they could climb up and grab it with their own hands. Rather, they wait for God in the place where God has designated, seeing that one in their midst has betrayed God and thought about himself first, namely Judas, who betrayed Christ, and then turning radically inward upon himself in an act of absolute self-alienation, took his own life. They decide that Christ's original choice of the 12, 12 being the number of universality, the number of Catholicity, this must represent God's will for the church. This is the new Israel, the new church, according to Christ's choice, right? And so they seek to do nothing other than restore it, and to do so by recognizing God's choice of who's to replace Judas. Thus, they cast lots. This was a sort of, a luck of the draw, right? But they didn't think of it as luck. They thought of this action, right, as allowing God the space to make his own choice. God will show us who he chooses, because the person who draws the right straw will be the one, right? God will decide who picks that particular straw, right? Or whatever technique they use. And so Matthias is selected, right, to take the place of Judas. And they have done nothing here but reconstructed the circle of the 12, which Judas, through his own unilateral action, had presumed to injure. Now they wait in the upper room where Christ had told them to go. Here they wait dutifully. They've been here for a long time. They've been spending their lives. This is their home from the time of the resurrection. And so we see this event occur. When Pentecost Day came round, they had all met in one room. So if we think about the Passion of Christ occurring at the time of the Passover, then Pentecost is the feast, right, 50 days hence, in which finally, right, we celebrate what? If Passover represents the entrance into the desert, the flight from Egypt, freedom from bondage, Pentecost in the ancient Jewish calendar, well, still the Jewish calendar now, represents the feast at which the Torah is given by God on Mount Sinai, right? So what's the significance then, right? Here, the Passover, the new Passover, Christ's passion, which frees us from the bondage of sin and death, is met with the giving of the Torah in the most radical sense possible. Namely, what? Where the law will be inscribed upon the hearts of the faithful, the descent of the Holy Spirit who comes to indwell us. When Pentecost Day came round, they had all met in one room, right? So here we see people coming together. When suddenly they heard what sounded like a powerful wind from heaven, a ruah Elohim, if we were reading in Hebrew, right? Like the Spirit of God hovering over the waters at creation. The noise of which filled the entire house in which they were sitting. And something appeared to them that seemed like tongues of fire. These separated and came to rest on the head of each of them. Now remember the fire at the burning bush in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, right? Where Moses encounters God in the fire of the burning bush, which burns the bush but doesn't consume the bush. The bush is enveloped in this fire, and yet the bush is totally unharmed by it. The same thing happens now to the apostles. They are like the burning bush, where God himself comes to dwell in a great theophany. He envelops them in fire, a fire that does not destroy, but enlivens them and purifies them. They were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in foreign languages as the Spirit gave them the gift of speech. Notice how at the Tower of Babel, the people are dispersed from one place, and each now speaks his own language, which no one else can understand. In the upper room, however, they all come together into one place, and now they can each speak all those different languages. So now the barrier of communication that difference in language presents is transcended. Now there were devout men living in Jerusalem from every nation under heaven. And at this sound they all assembled, each one bewildered to hear these men speaking in his own language. They were amazed and astonished. Surely, they said, all these men speaking are Galileans. How does it happen that each of us hears them in his own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, people from Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya round Cyrene, as well as visitors from Rome, Jews and proselytes alike, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them preaching in our own language about the marvels of God. You see how this contrasts with the story of the Tower of Babel? At the beginning of the story of the Tower of Babel, they all spoke one language about the same thing. They were oriented to the east, where God dwells. They were talking about God. But then they started talking about themselves, and then they started speaking only their own language, unable to communicate with others, and now doomed to a world of alienation. This has been transcended. All the languages of the world now are broken into by the power of the Holy Spirit, as all come together in the same place, once again, to speak about the same thing, namely God, the marvels of God. Everyone was amazed and unable to explain it. They asked one another what it all meant. Some, however, laughed it off. They have been drinking too much new wine, they said. Now those who laughed it off, dismissed it as some sort of bizarre anomaly, clearly they couldn't understand what was being said. The language of the Holy Spirit, the language of love, the language of sanctity, would not penetrate their hardened hearts. They were still living in the world of Babel. But to those who had turned toward God, to receive the Holy Spirit, to receive the Torah into themselves, when God would write his law on their hearts, they understood. They were welcomed back into a kind of primordial holiness in which they spoke one language about the same thing.